How can lenders turn complex residential infill into high-margin, low-risk portfolios? In this episode, we're exploring the Connecticut model with David Kooris, Executive Director of the CMDA. Discover how a new wave of public-private partnerships is providing the toolkit lenders need to de-risk downtown redevelopment and unlock new residential volume.
I'm a strong believer that by working collaboratively, we'll get farther than if we did state top-down mandates. But it involves building trust. It involves, being invited into that partnership and then demonstrating that it is a partnership. We work with our member municipalities. We identify a development district. We quantify the build-out potential of that district, how many housing units, commercial square footage, et cetera. And then we identify the infrastructure that's necessary to unlock the total potential of that place.
I'd like to welcome everybody today to the Construction Lending Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Ferris. We've got a special guest for you today, David Kooris, Executive Director at Connecticut's Municipal Development Authority. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. Right on.
That's great. So what's going on in Connecticut?
Yeah, so we've got this new quasi-public authority, CMDA, the Connecticut Municipal Development Authority, that was launched about a year and a half ago, and it's designed to be a comprehensive toolkit to support towns and cities in their efforts to build up their downtowns and the areas around their train stations. It's basically meant to fill the gap and provide resources and expertise that they may not have within their local government so that they can evolve into the best versions of themselves that they can be.
Not quite private sector, not quite public sector, but somebody just kind of in the middle to help.
Yep.
Say like navigate, kind of.
Yeah, leans a little bit more public than private. We are a creature of the state. We're created by legislation, and our seed funding is the state. I kind of think of it as a startup where the state is my key anchor investor, but we're governed by a board that includes representatives of both the public and the private sector. And we exist, outside of the bureaucracy. And so we're a little bit less constrained and able to be a little bit more nimble and able to tailor our response to what we hear from our towns and cities as their greatest need.
So why is this even needed? What's the problem people are running into that makes this so important?
So Connecticut's interesting. We have no county government. We have 169 municipalities, no unincorporated land. And those towns and cities really vary in their capacity. Some have the full complement of city departments and can really do quite a lot. Others don't, and they need support and for a variety of different things, whether it's infrastructure or planning or quantifying their zoning or land assemblage, any of the tools that go into redevelopment. And so, we're not supplanting their local authority, but we're adding capacity in ways that they may not have. A lot of our town and city governments are pretty small. So they have big vision, but they need support to realize it.
How does, as I'm kind of getting my muscle memory kind of going on in my head, trying to think through this, I'm on the completely opposite side of the nation, right, in California. And I know California is just unique in so many different ways. For people listening, maybe a little background on what makes Connecticut unique. Why can't a developer just go get something done? They got some land, let's just go build on it kind of thing. What's different about Connecticut to begin with?
Yeah, so I think sometimes they can, but I think much like California, there is a robust environmental review process. There are regulatory steps at both the state and the municipal level. And oftentimes you need someone just to help navigate that and to help make sure that all the mechanisms of government are working in the same direction. Connecticut was also really big on suburbanization. And in the 60s and 70s, we were very successful as being a lower density, kind of forested, bucolic alternative to New York City and to a lesser extent, Boston. But now as we look to revitalize our downtowns and our town and city centers and orient growth around our robust rail system, it's not as easy as developing on a greenfield out in the countryside. It takes coordination, it takes alignment with utilities, it takes navigating many different cumulative permits. And so I think it's less about something unique about Connecticut, and I think it's more about Connecticut or California or similar states push back towards infill development and redevelopment that takes, just breaking down the silos and a more coordinated approach. It's a lot harder to build on a gray field or a brown field within an existing neighborhood than it is to develop a green field out on the metropolitan edge.
I got it. I got it. Give me an idea of like some of the issues that a builder or developer would be running into where kind of your guys' sweet spot where you can help them with. What is kind of like your typical, not
Yeah.
your typical customer profile look like, but what does the typical profile look like of somebody you
Yeah.
help?
So I think a lot of the developers that we deal with are just having financing challenges. Cost of construction is going up, interest rates are high, while rents are high, and we don't want them to get any higher. It still doesn't cover the full cost of debt and equity that it's required to complete the capital stack. And so for some communities, it's just coming in with lower interest mezzanine debt, overcoming that gap and bringing the project to fruition. For other communities, it's navigating the state permitting process. We, like California and other states, have environmental review. We have an energy and environmental protection department that maybe has slightly different objectives than state historic preservation, which maybe has slightly different objectives than the transportation department, and trying to balance the needs of all those different constituencies and sort of thread the needle towards a project that can get permitted at the state level is a way that we lend support. But then at the local level, it's oftentimes helping with strategy and zoning, making sure that the local regulations are actually aligned with what the town is trying to achieve. And so part of what we do is a local zoning review and certification process to determine whether or not, the zoning is calibrated with what the town or city is trying to achieve, and whether or not a developer can look at that with a high enough level of certainty and know that what they're proposing is going to get approved. We talk to communities all the time that, they want that subjectivity, they want that authority, they want to be able to say yes or no, which is important, but it has to be balanced with enough clarity and communication to the development community so that they have reasonable certainty about what's going to get them to a yes or to a no. Because if they don't know whether or not the project that they're proposing that seems to be aligned with zoning is going to ultimately result in a yes or a no, they're going to move on to someplace else. And so helping communities clearly articulate what their objectives are and how to get to a yes is a big part of the service that we provide.
Very interesting. In the beginning, it almost sounded like you kind of go in and even help them critique the regulation or the policies that are there to begin with, and even maybe push back on the policy as well. Like, hey,
Yes.
this is bad. This is not standard. You're not going to get the outcome. Like, is there? So there's some
Yeah,
work there that
that is absolutely part of the step. So we're an opt-in model. And so towns and cities have to raise their hand to work with us. And out of the 169 municipalities, this gets a little wonky, but 167 are eligible because the capital city, Hartford, and East Hartford have a separate redevelopment authority. And then of those 167, you have to have a train station or a bus rapid transit station or a walkable mixed use downtown. So that narrows the list little bit further. Maybe there's about 100 that theoretically could work with us. And so far we have 43 member communities. So we're incredibly, excited and proud about that level of uptake. They're all different sizes. They're all different corners of the state. They represent a great cross section of the communities. And so they can provide lessons and precedent for other communities that maybe have some of the same characteristics. But once they invite us in, we do look at their zoning only within that target geography. So we don't concern ourselves with what's happening in every single family neighborhood around every corner of the town or the city, but we look at within 1/2 a mile of the train or BRT station, and we look at the downtown. And that's exactly the analysis that we go through is based on our professional assessment. We say, Is there something in this zoning that's not actually working? Maybe it's not achieving what you thought it would achieve, or maybe it raises a red flag for a developer that you don't intend to raise, or maybe it interjects a level of subjectivity that creates too much uncertainty. And we give them feedback and recommendations about how to get their zoning to a point where we're willing to certify it so that we can move on to the establishment of a district to create funding eligibility.
What are like the first place my mind goes to is like, well, what are you finding? And I ask that question from having lots of conversation, especially when it gets to zoning over stuff that's just been there for a long time. And people are surprised, like, what? Like
Yes.
that's, and you've never changed that?
Yeah.
Are you finding like the similar, characters
Absolutely.
in
Yeah,
that review?
absolutely. I think there is a little bit of a misperception about the magnitude of bad actors, right? That there's all these municipalities that are doing everything they can behind the scenes to block development or to prevent this or that type of multifamily. There are communities that do that. Absolutely. I don't want to pretend like that doesn't exist. But the majority of communities that we work with, and there's some self-selection there, right? Because these are the ones that have raised their hand and they want some support in growing their downtown or their station area. But it is almost exclusively a poison pill that was put in there 2 administrations ago. They don't even realize it's there. A lot of times communities say, we think our zoning's good. We don't understand why we're not getting the kind of development that we are telegraphing we desire. And oftentimes we say, well, this is why. It's this one clause. And oftentimes they seem well-meaning. I'll tell you one we encounter a lot is, it's a main street. They want mixed-use development. The community wants residential above, but they want that ground floor retail. They want something that's going to activate the storefront and create that kind of pedestrian, vibrant, engaging, walkable environment, but they require that the commercial component be at least 51% of the gross square footage of the building. Well, if you're building a 4-story building, that means 2 of the 4 floors are going to be commercial. And that's
That's
just
no
not,
math.
yeah, the math just doesn't work. It's not even going to cover the entirety of the ground floor because you need circulation and you need lobby and maybe even want some ground oriented residential units on the backside of the building, et cetera. And so it's things like that that are oftentimes well intentioned, just executed in a way that create a critical flaw that folks don't even recognize is there.
I love it. I want to hear another one. That's a great one.
Yeah. Yeah. So, parking is very often one, and it's often, we have new state law, which is going to kind of cap the maximum requirements, but it's often in the commercial piece, right? I find residential parking varies, of course, but it's usually not egregiously large. Whereas if the kind of ground floor activity that you're looking to get is a restaurant or, certain types of shops, I mean, I've found the restaurant distinction, you need this many spaces if it's a sit down, if it's this many spaces if it's sit down but you offer takeout, it's this many spaces if there's a takeout counter, right? And some of these numbers can be 20 spaces per 1,000 square feet. I mean, they can just be very significant and completely undermine the ability to get to that mixed use walkable environment where if it is a true main street and there's a public parking reservoir that this district relies upon, you can be pretty lenient on the commercial parking because you want it to be a park once environment, right? You want it to be a kind of place where people get out of their car and stroll around and stop by multiple stores and, go out for the drink after the restaurant, not thinking about whether or not they can get in their car and mobilize from each storefront to the next so that there's always a place to park at the front door.
Oh man, I'm just having flashbacks to a story my friend had told me where they were under this immense amount of just pressure from our local city to pay these kind of egregious fees, kind of similar to the parking situation. Like, oh, now we're gonna have to put in a traffic light and do all of this.
Yeah.
And they ended up sitting down and just kind of having a conversation with the city, and they had to bring their attorneys and their attorneys, and it would have been great to have somebody like you sit in the middle. And what they ended up discovering is that the city was calculating all of this traffic and then all of these parking needs. And what they were doing was converting a hardware store to a storage facility. And they run a moving company as well as like have, actual storage units to that. So it actually, there's not a lot of traffic in there, definitely a reduction of traffic. Parking places, it's not like there's people showing up there parking other than employees. So that kind of goes down. But nobody had brought up the question. It was like, hey, we're actually reducing it from the previous usage. Do we get a credit back?
Right.
And it was like foreign to them.
Yeah, we find that a lot as well, where whether it's the conversion of old office buildings into residential or the conversion of brownfields and old manufacturing sites into mixed use kind of town centers, especially when the site has been vacant for some time, there's a tendency to compare what's being proposed to the current, which is nothing, right? No traffic, no parking, no demand. Instead of comparing it to the past when it was at its prior heyday and producing tremendous amounts of traffic, had tremendous amounts of parking, and very oftentimes the kinds of modern uses, particularly walkable and transit oriented, are going to be a reduction from, whatever it was when it was humming in the 50s or 60s or 70s.
Very interesting. Like, how do you, is that more of a mindset with them with the planning department or building department, like getting them to kind of shift their focus to being helpful from, hey, we got to get something out of this deal? Or
Yeah.
what do you find the mentality is of these?
Yeah. So, I think oftentimes, first and foremost, once it gets to the staff level and it's being operationalized, it moves pretty smoothly, right?
Okay.
It's usually a political challenge a little bit earlier on with the philosophy. The vast majority of bureaucrats are just implementing the rules that they've been given, right? And so they're taking the rule and they're making sure that the project abides by it. But you're absolutely right that kind of that early philosophical approach of, right, not wanting to let developers get off the hook, right? Wanting to make sure that they're paying their fair share, that they're managing the impacts of their development. I completely understand and can sort of associate with, but the way our country operated for, most of its history is investing in infrastructure that will lead to the kind of growth that we want to see. And then that growth results in building permit fees and tax revenue. And that's what the public gets back from development, not to mention the jobs and the housing units and, the community benefits. But I think we have gotten out of that mode, certainly in Connecticut, where if I had my way and where our kind of aspirational future trends is we work with our member municipalities, we identify a development district, we quantify the build out potential of that district, how many housing units, commercial square footage, et cetera. And then we identify the infrastructure that's necessary to unlock the total potential of that place. And we invest in that. We get federal funds, we allocate state funds, and we divorce that from the individual building implementation. Because oftentimes, as I said earlier, the development isn't penciling out to begin with. And then if you're layering on infrastructure requirements that have broader community benefit, you're just making it harder. And I'd love to see us proactively invest in that community infrastructure up front and then reap the rewards through building permit fees, property taxes, housing units, and jobs that'll come when the buildings are built and filled.
I really like the balance that, like, hey, you're here both to help the municipality or the local government there, as well as the builder and the developer. And you've given some really good examples. Why would somebody not want to use you guys? Right? Like that's what it's kind of starting to get me think, like, why would we not want to at least get a second set of eyes going, like, hey, are we on the right track? Are we doing something here that maybe we shouldn't? Or like, why not?
Yeah. No, listen, I think you're absolutely right. And that's certainly my mindset, but it's a new dynamic, right? Communities aren't always used to reaching out for that kind of a third party review, particularly when it's affiliated with the state, right? And we are quasi public, but we are an entity of the state. And so for a town or city to invite the state in and kind of open up their regulations and invite recommendations and advice, it's just not a situation that they've been in previously. And so what we hear often, most often, is just a fear that by inviting us in, they're somehow giving up control. And so the majority of, my outreach and engagement with communities early on is helping them understand that, listen, we might not ultimately get to agreement. And we might not get to a point where we're willing to fund infrastructure because we haven't certified your zoning, but I can't force you to get there. It's going to be collaborative. We may make recommendations, but they're ultimately your purview whether or not to adopt those recommendations. And so, I'm a strong believer that by working collaboratively, we'll get farther than if we did state top-down mandates, but it involves building trust. It involves, being invited into that partnership and then demonstrating that it is a partnership.
Now I'm getting curious. What is it? Is there usually like a council member or a somebody that's running ops for, say, like a city that gives you a call or sees you at a conference, like, hey, can you come do a presentation for our group? Like,
Yep.
is that typically how it goes?
Yeah, so it originates with kind of one of several places. Oftentimes, yes, it is the city or town manager, the mayor, the first selectman, or a member of the local legislative body who has seen what we're doing in another community or seen us at an event and invites us in to talk about what it could be like in their community. A lot of times it's a developer too. It's a developer who is in a community having a hard time making a project work, realizing that we could be a tool to be that mediator and overcome some of those barriers. And so they make the introduction with the host community.
No, that's exactly where I was kind of going with it. Like, how much of it comes from a developer that's, hey, we used you guys over in this city over here, and God, they could really use you over here, or things are really at a stalemate. So
Yeah.
it does come both directions.
Yeah, I'd say it's about a third developer initiated, two-thirds public sector initiated. And, with the developer initiated, it's always tricky. We can't be viewed as an agent for the developer, right? We have to be viewed as an honest broker, technical support, and implementation tool. So it depends, right? If it's going to be driven by a developer, we try and do our due diligence on that project and understand, is this something that is aligned with local and state goals and it's just getting hung up on the process? Or is this something where a developer is trying to leverage us to force something through that isn't locally supported and may not even be aligned with the state priorities?
Yeah, I can't tell you how important that trust, that line that you're discussing right there, that trust and transparency is. Because once one party perceives you on the other side,
Correct.
you're toast, right?
Correct.
Oh, hey, they're just bringing us in to enforce all their, the agenda stuff that they want to get done, and that's why they're not really here to meet in the middle and help a thriving community. Have you kind of seen that, or kind of been kind of pulled or pushed one way? I mean, that seems to be a
Yeah.
big issue for me.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because of our narrow focus, right? We have this geographic laser on station areas and downtowns. That avoids some of the bigger conflict, right? Because there's a lot of projects that we're just not eligible to support, right? So that big sprawling subdivision that, wants us to help mediate with the town, not aligned with our mission, not in a downtown, not around a station area. So there is this kind of built-in filtering where if you're an eligible geography or an eligible municipality, if you've opted in, if we're establishing a district, it's almost inevitable that the kinds of projects and developers that are going to want to work with us in that district are aligned with both, the state and the municipality's vision. Not 100%, but based on our process, there is a filtering that I think minimizes the potential for that disagreement.
You mentioned kind of infrastructure, grants, funding. Tell me a little bit more about that, because the way I'm thinking about it is like kind of like a carrot approach of like, hey,
Absolutely.
we got this really cool thing. If you guys want some, come over here and get it. What's
Yep.
the
Yeah, so absolutely carrot based. The governor is very much committed to incentivizing communities who want to grow by giving them the resources and the support that they need to do so. One of my colleagues referred to it as a frozen carrot, right? It's a carrot, but it's hard enough that we can whack people a little bit with it as we go through the zoning certification process, but it's voluntary. So if you don't want to go through the process, you don't get to the funding eligibility. But we have a $90 million allocation, and that funds, technical assistance, which will be a relatively small piece of that. I think the majority of that is going to be the low interest loans directly to developers. And then a good chunk of it will be infrastructure grants to municipalities. So if there's a transportation improvement or a wastewater treatment improvement or a public realm improvement that is directly linked to the development potential and unlocking, a site or two, the municipality can apply directly to us. And then if it's the developer seeking financing, they can apply directly to us. And I think what's interesting is how we have, as I said, we have 43 members today, and they're starting to sort into these different buckets, right? Some have their plan in place. The local regulations are great. Projects need financing, right? There's an economic failure taking or a market failure taking place. Others, the zoning's good, there's demand, but there's an infrastructure hurdle that's holding them back from reaching that potential. And that's where we can fill in. In others, they've got the vision and the strategy, but they need to translate it into better regulations to attract developers. In some, it's land assemblage so that the public sector can drive a larger redevelopment project. And in others still, it's strategy. A lot of the ones where we're playing a more planning role at the earlier stages of the development process are places that are more suburban, and they're trying to undo some of the mistakes of sprawl, trying to regain their town center, evolve the commercial strip into something that's more mixed use and walkable. But the beauty is the way that we're structured, we can tailor our support to meet the varying needs of each of those community types.
That's pretty cool. Do any of them fail? Like, hey, they kind of start and it's like, little crash or
Yeah. So, I wouldn't say that any, well, one, we're too early to have
okay.
gotten to that stage yet, but I don't think any will ever fail. They just may get stuck at one step or another. And that's okay, right?
What gets you stuck though? Like what? And that's kind of what I'm getting at is like,
Yeah.
is it the people? Is it the politics? Is it the policy? Like, what is it
Yeah.
that prevents them from moving forward?
Yeah. So it could absolutely be people in politics, right? It could be that what's holding them back is local regulations and we make regulatory recommendations and the carrot just isn't big enough and the local planning and zoning commission doesn't take the recommendations up. And so we don't move on to funding eligibility. In other places, in a lot of instances, unfortunately, it's just physical constraints. It's a lack of, larger parcel sizes, parcels that are controlled by folks that are not interested in redevelopment. It's things like flood risk, which is very real on the coast in Connecticut. And so sometimes the solutions to overcome those challenges is just not worth the return, right? A big part of what we see our role is quantifying the development potential to determine whether or not the infrastructure or public sector investment is worth what you get back at the end of the day in terms of number of housing units or economic development. And sometimes, overcoming the flood risk, bringing in the wastewater treatment expansion, providing the pedestrian bridge, it's just not justified based on the level of development that you're likely to get at the end of the day. Whereas a comparable investment two communities over will create that return.
Yeah, we've got kind of this overpass that's been sitting there, and I don't know, maybe 20 years now that we this really important overpass to kind of mitigate traffic and kind of gets pushed. One developer goes bankrupt waiting for permits, and then the next one comes in, and now the cost is like four times the amount than what it was if they would have just put the infrastructure in when they had the opportunity. But trying to shift those costs to a developer rather than taking care of their own infrastructure.
Yeah.
What
And
you go ahead.
I was just saying, then it becomes a balancing act, right? If you're trying to get the private sector to deliver that infrastructure, then they need to make a return. And so they need a certain amount of development potential to offset that cost. And it just may ultimately be more than the community's willing to absorb. I oftentimes work with communities, there'll be that gas station at the 100% corner, right? And they really want that replaced with development that's more keeping in line with the rest of the town center, but they don't want the building to be taller than 3 stories. And, we go through the analysis and we say, listen, it's not actually a debate between that 3-story building and the gas station because that 3-story building can't be built, but the 5-story building can. So is that what you're willing to accommodate in order to redevelop this gas station? And sometimes when you go through that economic analysis and you help kind of quantify it and create the objective criteria, it brings communities to that same conclusion. In other times, it's just a bridge too far.
You're like a mediator or a therapist for this. Like, I'm not kidding. The more I think about this, is this working? Have you guys been doing this long enough to see some good results here?
Yeah. So, I've certainly been doing this type of stuff for almost 20 years and can say definitively that, the approach works. As we're using it now in the Municipal Development Authority, I'd say we're just getting to the point where we're demonstrating that it works. I think we started in the middle of 24. The first 6 months was getting the organization up and running. In our first year, getting 43 municipalities to raise their hand was a really strong testament to the model. Now we're moving into funding. We just awarded our first loan to a 156 unit mixed income transit oriented development across the street from a planned train station.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. And that really makes it real for people, right? And so now, we're at the point where we have, mayors who are saying they're providing technical assistance that's helping me, right? We have developers who say this was a tool that got me to a groundbreaking. And so as that word starts to get out there and that breeds further interest, that will support further funding. And I think we're on a path to build out a suite of tools that fills a gap that doesn't otherwise exist in state agencies.
Was the governor the one that kind of came up with this and pushing it? I mean, this is a good long tail commitment. You gotta invest up front,
Absolutely.
but you're not going to see the results in.
Yeah, so it was a partnership with the General Assembly, but Governor Lamont absolutely underpins this vision of incentive-based, voluntary and participatory approach. And, I tell people all the time, you can probably get to results faster with mandates, but there's a ceiling, right? There's always going to be a ceiling at which mandates cannot go beyond. There's just not the tolerance for that top-down approach. It takes longer to do this bottom-up collaborative approach, but I believe wholeheartedly that you'll ultimately get further towards a solution to these complex problems that our communities are facing than you'll ever get with mandates.
Yeah. Did you guys come up with this idea? Is this modeled after a different state, or did you guys see this somewhere else, or are you guys pioneering this?
Yeah, so I was not directly involved in the legislation that created it. The governor's chief of staff, who was then with the Speaker of the House of the General Assembly, was really the brainchild behind it. And I think they took really the best of what they saw working from a couple different buckets and tied them together in one place. And so we had the Capital Region Development Authority that was providing gap financing for housing projects in Hartford. That was incredibly successful. We had seen these other pilot projects around technical assistance related to housing. We had a strong redevelopment history that was kind of waning because of the mistakes and the blowback after urban renewal. And it kind of took the best of each of those and tied them together in one package, and then making it opt in as a true partnership between the authority and these member municipalities was absolutely an innovation. And as I've been talking about it, I'm becoming increasingly clear that there is nothing exactly like this elsewhere in the country.
Do you ever get, like, I can only imagine you got market for 100 is what you said. How do you scale that from the people perspective of having the talent within what you guys are doing to be able to identify these things and get things done? Like, You feel
Yeah.
pulled in multiple directions, or
Yeah.
how do
Excellent
you get the
question.
right people on your team?
Yeah, excellent question, and certainly a struggle. And I think as typical for government initiated programs, having the funding to invest in the work is less of a challenge than having the operational funding to manage the investments. And so I was the only employee of the authority for its first year and built up all the systems. We have the board, of course, that I can lean on to a degree. We now have 3 people and we'll hire a fourth later this year. But we will not ever be a large staff. We will be heavily reliant on consultants and building out that external team to deliver the right solution for our member municipalities. But managing that is challenging. I would say it's much more orchestra than it is like sports team, right?
Yep.
Because you have these independent contractors. We have 17 on-call consultants, not including, legal and communications and IT, et cetera, but 17 consultant teams that we are constantly experimenting with and matching with member municipalities. And we think this one is better suited to help you visualize the outcome, to build stakeholder support. We think this one is better suited to quantify the economic potential, to build local legislative support. We think this group is better suited to actually write the zoning to help you. But it's challenging. It is absolutely challenging, and we'll get to a point where it's a little bit easier. But we are absolutely at that stage where it's kind of seeding a lot of these different pilots to sort of see what works, to then institutionalize the way that will enable it to scale more easily.
Are you thinking, so are these consultants like made up of like engineering and architectural firms, maybe like a little legal component in there,
Yep.
for them? Okay.
Yep. So we have our outside counsel, and then these teams are typically, architecture, urban planning, urban design, engineering, and some of them are better at the public participation process. Some of them are better at graphics and visualization. Some are better at the economics and the quantification, and just drawing from each of them to that matchmaking is really interesting, is kind of
Yeah.
learning enough about the member municipality to understand their need, matching them with the right consultants to help sort of advance the strategy, then matching them with the right resources to invest in the catalytic infrastructure, and pairing them, if requested, with the right developer who can build in a way that they're looking to see. Now, we don't play every one of those roles in every communities, right? In some, it's just one of those, but in others, it's that full suite of basically being their kind of contracted development and planning office.
Now, it's all super fascinating. Very, very, very fascinating. Has any other states reached out to you and go like, "Hey, we want to learn more. Can we come sit down with you? We want to see how this is working." Like, are you guys that far along yet where you're getting that kind
Yeah,
of attention?
I'd say so far it's been the inverse, where we've reached out to folks that we think are doing some things that are similar to try and learn from them. And I think, probably in about a year, we'll do more amplification and broadcasting to try and be a resource for others. But every state's a little bit different. There's certainly strengths that are out there. We've seen a lot of interesting results in Massachusetts and New Jersey, kind of close by here, in Minnesota around TOD. But I do think we're on the cusp of being at a stage where there could be this network, this national network of kind of development authorities. That is not an association. I'm very involved in the American Planning Association. I've been involved in ULI over the years, but I don't know of a place where kind of the government agencies involved in the redevelopment process and infrastructure and assemblage kind of convene. There's been such a stigma against that because of the problems of urban renewal, and rightfully so. That critique is warranted and necessary. But I think California is probably at the front line of thinking, what does redevelopment look like in the 21st century? And I think that there's a gap there to bring like-minded folks together from around the country to kind of chart out what that looks like going forward.
It's definitely complicated, but it sounds like you guys are figuring a lot of that out and having some
Cheers.
success at doing it too.
Cheers.
Well, what have we missed here? I mean, we've covered so much in the podcast. What have I feel like I'm maybe missing something.
I think one thing that I would say is so much of this, like the vision that we have about kind of walkable and transit-oriented centers, it's very interesting for Connecticut because we don't have that one big city. We have a constellation of smaller cities that can be strung together so that they function like neighborhoods of something larger. But it fundamentally depends on the transit service, right? The quality and the diversity of that service. And I think, we're at a challenging stage right now with a lack of investment in that kind of technology. And so it's going to be really interesting to follow, whether it's kind of Southern California with their transit expansions, not to mention, high-speed rail, and sort of see the way in which states are finding innovative ways to bring service enhancement across the finish line, because this only works if these communities are anchored by a robust, diverse, affordable, efficient, attractive, transportation choices that balance out the needs of the car.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, I don't think I'd use California's high speed rail as any
Model.
type of uh, good example in there, but little bit of a sore subject over here. One of the interesting things that we talked about, we kind of like really, I would say, danced around regulation, but it was kind of at the core of what we really talked about. Is there a specific regulation? Could be state, could be federal, local, whatever it is. Like if we can just snap our fingers right now and you could get rid of it, which one would it be?
Yeah. I don't know that I would say get rid of, but we need to fundamentally reform environmental review so that it has the ability to balance local and global environmental impacts. We're really good at stopping stuff that impacts, that wetland, really bad at balancing the impact of that wetland with the viability of the earth as a result of climate change and emissions. And so, in a new environmental review process that takes climate into better consideration has to be something that we develop.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Recent book or movie that you've recently discovered that you think is something that people should be paying attention to?
Yeah. So, it's funny because I almost exclusively read nonfiction, and I could rattle off any number of recent urban planning, or housing policy books. But I did just finish a fiction book. And so I'm going to lean in. I
All right.
love kind of climate-based sci-fi. And there's a book I just finished called Artificial Wisdom, which brings in sort of climate change, artificial intelligence, climate change, and I thought did a really good job of laying out some of the big challenges that we're going to be facing over the coming decades.
Very cool. Artificial wisdom.
Yes,
Something I could get for my Kindle, or
absolutely.
hopefully they have an audio version I could listen to.
I don't know, but the sequel comes out this fall, so you can tee yourself up to a couple book sequence at least.
All right. I got a new question. You're the first person to get this one. How has AI changed your job?
Yeah. So what I've been seeing is the ability with AI to render future alternatives and put a visual on an idea in a way that other people can understand that we could always do with photo simulations and, very developed architectural renderings. But the ability for more people to quickly put a visual behind their idea, because so many people need to see what you're talking about in order for it to be real to them. I think that's going to be a game changer.
Now we're going to go a little further on this one because you got my curiosity. Give me an example on how that would work.
Yeah. So, so oftentimes understanding what that infill development will look like within the context of the main street is really difficult for people to wrap their head around. I mean, I've even seen examples in Europe going back 20 years where in certain historic districts, they mandate that you build out a scaffolding mock-up of the future building in life size so that people, yes, so that people can see how it fits in with the main street. And again, this is something that we've been able to do for decades with photo simulations, but that was a niche expertise in order to make it look right. And I think that that's being democratized to a degree where anyone with a policy idea related to the built environment, I think, can produce a visual that will articulate to constituents and stakeholders what it will actually look like. And I might add, though, also run the risk, there's a great book going back several decades, How to Lie with Maps. How to lie with visualizations is also a big piece of it too, because if you control what you say it will look like in the future, you control people's perception of it. So there is a potential risk there. But I think being able, listen, I always reference, HGTV, and, people go into the house and they say, I can't possibly buy this because the paint color in the bedroom I don't like. People have an incredibly difficult time visualizing change.
They do.
So the more that you can hand that to them and graphically articulate the results of the policy that you're looking to advance, the more success that you'll have.
Here's what the 5-story looks like where that gas station is instead of the 3-story. Does it really make that big of an impact? Right. Especially if you could do that quick or even on the fly from your tablet. On the fly. Could make
early in my career, when I was much younger and still in grad school, I built a niche expertise of doing photo simulations on the fly within the context of a workshop. Incredibly difficult and labor intensive and never exactly right. You can do that with AI nearly instantaneously, could tremendously help in the participatory process.
No, I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I think I learned, a whole lot about planning and urban development and how to bring parties together. But would love to have you on the podcast again in the future. Wish you the best of luck. Any last words?
No, that'd be great. Just thanks so much for having me. Really appreciated chatting with you, Sean. It's been a great conversation.
And now if people want to get in touch with you, they like something they heard, they want to learn more, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Absolutely. So our website is www.wearecmda.org, and that'll lead you to our socials and all the different ways that you can be in touch.
All right. David Kooris, Executive Director of Connecticut Municipal Development Authority. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace independent professional judgment. Land Gorilla Inc. makes no representations, warranties, or promises for and disclaims any express or implied warranties related to content. Before acting on any information, you should consider the appropriateness of the information as it pertains to your unique business needs.